So we found the style of music used in the first two Bejeweled video games, but in Bejeweled 3, Scoven252, the person who made the OSTs, took a different approach for the soundtrack. I sought out the musical style used in the Bejeweled 3 OSTs, and I found some pretty promising results in the world of Dungeon Synth. So ladies and gentlemen, these are 5 Symphonic Dungeon Synth musicians to open your mind. Anyone who has played the Bejeweled video games remembers the fantasy twist the OST for the third game took. The first two sounded like melodic synth pop, whereas the third game had more of a fantasy vibe to it. Like it's your typical fantasy mobile game, while still remaining in the framework of synth music. As someone who is into metal, I probably should have checked out Dungeon Synth before diving into the world of synth pop, but today I shined the light on a form of synth music that metalheads actually get behind. At least some metalheads anyway. Now, in forming this list, I wanted to do a top 10 list, but I found that I was going down the rabbit hole of fantasy ambient Dungeon Synth, and it started to really stray from what I was after. But I think that enjoyers of the Bejeweled 3 OST will love these 5 Symphonic Dungeon Synth musicians. Number 5 is Trogul with the album Beyond the River Sky. With the album representing this particular musician, you get a slow-paced, relaxing effort that uses bells, mandolins, flutes, and percussion that make for a wonderful fantasy soundtrack. The second track from the album, titled The Wanderings of Rune, I think would make for a great Halloween-themed track, or even just as a song to search an abandoned temple or a dark forest to. Trogul takes the mysterious route in Symphonic Dungeon Synth. Their stuff has a really great flow. If you showed this to me in 2015 before I started listening to Bathory, I'd definitely be interested in hearing more, not just from these people, but from the genre of Dungeon Synth. Very good fantasy music. Back in the summer of 2015, I was super into Sword Art Online, and I was watching the Mother's Rosario arc on Toonami. Once that week's episode was over, I would go listen to the Bejeweled 3 OST. If these guys were around, if they released their first CD like 6 months earlier, I would have been hooked on this kind of music and fantasy anime for 7 years. The 7th track from the album, Their Thrones for the Spider to Spin On, kicks it up a notch, and you get more of the tempo that the Bejeweled 3 OST is known for. The 8th and final track, Lands Behind the East, remind me a little bit of folk metal. Really cool melodies on that track. I definitely recommend Trogul to fans of folk metal and fans of synth music that are looking for something in the realm of neoclassical. Number 4 is Wind Tower with the album The Eldest One. This is where I started to fall down the rabbit hole of fantasy ambient, so these guys have influences in ambient music, but we have synthesizers and we have the chimes of keyboards that the Bejeweled 3 OST is known for. Just because they have influences from ambient doesn't mean that they're completely devoid of catchiness though. It does mean that their music is much slower paced than Trogul. They still incorporate the instruments that you would hear in medieval music. The opening melodies are nice and catchy. The first and second tracks will easily get you to bob your head. Wind Tower presents an interesting path that fantasy synth can go down if we follow the trail, but I would say that they're much heavier on the medieval side than they are on the fantasy side. But they still managed to create some pretty cool stuff. Number 3 is Tarwin with the album Mournful Cycle of Kingdom. Staying on the ambient side, these guys might remind black metal and Viking metal fans of album preludes and outros depending on the bands they listen to. The second and third tracks in particular sound a lot like a victory song after a long and grueling battle with an ogre king. Sword in hand and blood splattered all over you, you take in the sight of dead bodies as you realize that you and your allies have finally overthrown a tyrannical ruler. I would almost say that that's the appeal of ambient Dungeon Synth, is its feelings of glorious victory after a harsh war. In that case, I'd say that this album would be a hit for those looking for something emotional to listen to. Number 2 is Torchlight with the album Haunted Dreams for the Dying King. Where Tarwin sounded a lot like the songs of glorious victory over a tyrannical king, Torchlight sounds a lot like the theme song of the Lair of a Tyrannical King with their opening track, Crows. They bring more of the medieval influence with their music that we see plenty of within the genre of Dungeon Synth. These guys remind me of something that would be on a black and folk metal album as a prelude or something to that nature. The synthesizers are affected to sound really like dungeon music, hence Dungeon Synth. Towards the second half of the album, it does turn back towards the type of music you would imagine playing during an emotional victory scene, although with a little more of a fantasy vibe. Although the 7th track is heavier and paints an image of Dracula's castle with its use of organs. And finally, number 1 is You're Pale with the album Crystal Waves Orchestra. Truly the ultimate example of what one would search for when looking for music that is similar in every way to the Bejeweled 3 OST. The opening track immediately sounds like something that would appear on a fourth installment of the Bejeweled video game series, which in the grossly capitalistic environment the gaming industry is in, it's probably for the best that doesn't happen. But musically, what might have been is always an undying curiosity that exists within us, but Your Pale seems to satisfy that. If we are to assume that Skaven252 would have done a second OST in Dungeon Synth style, as the first two games' OSTs were done in the style of synthpop, the Crystal Waves Orchestra serves as an idea for what would have been for the OST of Bejeweled 4. I know I talk about the Bejeweled game series a lot, but honestly, that is the motivation behind me making these videos. But anyway, Your Pale. Awesome use of orchestras, awesome soundtrack that gets one to bang their head as they fantasize riding on horseback into battle with a rival kingdom. Your Pale is great and all, but one thing this album is missing, unless covered by their other works, is the use of keyboards. The first track, Stone Wings Aloft, is picture perfect, but if we combine that with Wind Towers the Eldest One, I think we would have some pretty killer stuff. Call me a sucker for keyboards, but outside of the world of metal, for me, it doesn't get much better than epic symphonies with synthesizers and nice chiming keyboards. The fifth track I thought was pretty awesome. Jester's Fleet on a Sea of Fools reminds me of Bathory's later works. If Korthon were still alive today, I would almost bet on him incorporating dungeon synth and fantasy elements after he finished up with the Nordland saga. Nordland 3 and 4 would have been amazing. But, I mean, maybe Bathory would have gone down this route. But the second half of the Crystal Waves Orchestra truly reminds me of Viking metal and folk metal instrumentals, and that alone is amazing. I highly recommend this musician to fans of both metal and synth music, and if you're a synth fan that likes this kind of music, I highly recommend listening to folk metal when you get the chance. Really cool stuff. The beginning of the song, Raised by the Sword by Ensiferum, I think would fit just fine within Dungeon Synth. I would almost try to delve into the world of Dungeon Synth as a side project for when I'm not working on Death Wish, but I'd have to see, especially considering that I have a new job opportunity as an assembler. In fact, I had my interview yesterday, so at least I might be making my own money again real soon. Hopefully it'll be enough to actually support the artist instead of just do these videos in the spirit of free advertising. And also, I am really craving some chocolate-flavored Pop-Tarts, but all I've got's $1. Update on that interview was actually 2 days ago. Yesterday, August 19th, I fell ill and took the day off, and didn't edit this and release this as I had planned. Still feel a little stuffy, but I'm bouncing back just fine. But here's the deal with that. The pay was $15.50 an hour, which is great, but I'd be getting 48 hours a week in the form of 12 hours per day between 4 days. I would brave the long days, but the place that I would be working at is almost an hour away from where I live. So that's a whole 14-hour day before we take into account me getting up 3 hours before I leave the house so I can get ready, and overtime. Is that really the branch that the job market is extending? Do I really have to trade in my personal life just to be able to have some money? Jesus, 12 hours is already ridiculous on its own. But I'll speak more on that in September, because that interview gave me some ideas as to what to talk about. Fuck, I really don't want Halloween to roll around and still be jobless. Well, anyway, that concludes this list of 5 Symphonic Dungeon Synth musicians. If you like this video, please be sure to click thumbs up, share the video far and wide, leave some comments. Did I introduce you to a potential favorite? Did I open your mind to a style of music that you've never heard of, but love the hell out of? Have you heard of any of the musicians I listed? Do you have some more Symphonic Dungeon Synth artists? If so, please tell me in the comments below, and I may do a 5 more lists somewhere down the line. And please leave any and all feedback, as would be appreciated, and please be sure to subscribe for more content like this. Please also click the bell to get notified when I post a new video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all soon for another video. Bye, guys.